If you grew up in Britain between 1950 and 1980, you knew a bush radio, the brown Bakelite wireless on your nan's mantelpiece, or the cream portable above the kitchen sink. At its peak, the Bush factory at Ernesettle in Plymouth employed 2,500 people. They built the radios, televisions, and portables that became the brand every British household knew. They survived the war, turning their lathes to whatever the services needed. They survived rationing and the post-war timber shortage. They survived the leap from valve to transistor and put a wireless in every kitchen in Britain. And then, after nearly half a century of making, the company that built the soundtrack of British family life simply ended. How does a name on every kitchen mantelpiece in Britain end up a sticker on a Chinese kettle? What happened to Bush? Chapter 1. The Loudspeaker Man. The story begins, as so many British industrial stories do, with someone seeing a future the rest of the world hadn't quite caught up to. In 1932, in Shepherd's Bush, West London, a man named Gilbert Darnley Smith was looking at a problem. His company was already finished. Graham Amplion had spent the previous decade making those great brass horn loudspeakers that filled cinemas and ballrooms with the wonder of synchronized sound. But sound was moving on. The horn was giving way to the cone. The trade was shifting under his feet. And Darnley Smith, ex-managing director of a defunct firm, had a choice. He could find a quiet desk somewhere and disappear. Or he could persuade somebody, somewhere, that the next thing was already coming. He chose the second. The somebody he persuaded was Gaumont British, the cinema and film concern that had owned Graham Amplion as a subsidiary, and that was, in the early 30s, one of the largest entertainment businesses in the country. Darnley Smith's pitch was simple. The cinema industry, he told them, was going to be associated with television in a big way, sooner rather than later. If Gaumont wanted to be in pictures in the 1940s, it needed to be in receiving sets by the 1930s. He had the engineering knowledge. They had the cash. The shape of the deal almost wrote itself. And so, in 1932, on Woodger Road in Shepherd's Bush, a side street the rest of London had no reason to know, a new company was registered. They called it Bush Radio. The name came from the place. The place came from the studio. The studio belonged to a film company that had just decided to bet, modestly, on something it didn't yet understand. One of Britain's most beloved working-class brands began life as a tax-efficient sideline of a movie studio. The wireless that would sit on your nan's kitchen mantelpiece, the portable that would blare on 1,000 building sites, both started as a hedge on the future of cinema. For its first 4 years, Bush worked out of cramped premises on Woodger Road, building valve sets for a market that was learning, season by season, that a wireless was no longer a luxury, but a fixture. Hire purchase had opened the doors. The BBC had given the country something worth tuning in for. Demand, in the middle of a slump that was meant to flatten everything, kept on rising. By 1936, Bush had outgrown Shepherd's Bush. It moved east, not far, just to Power Road in Chiswick, into a proper factory with proper assembly lines. And in the same year, at the wireless exhibition at Olympia, it unveiled something most of the visitors had never seen before. 3 televisor sets, models T5, T6 and T7, built for bed television, pictures pulled out of the air, sound and vision in a wooden cabinet. The price was eye-watering, and the audience was tiny. There was only one programme to watch, broadcast from Alexandra Palace for a few hours each evening. But it was a beginning. Darnley Smith's pitch to Gaumont 4 years earlier had not been wrong. The cinema firm that had taken a punt on him was, by 1938, telling its shareholders that the radio subsidiary had contributed new and substantial income to the group. The hedge was paying for itself. By 1940, Bush was advertising the Bush Button, model PB63, a press button tuning radio that promised, in the language of the trade catalogues, to bring the stations of Europe to the touch of a finger. It was the kind of thing the British consumer electronics business did best in those years. Solid engineering, modest ambition, a clear sense of what an ordinary household wanted to put on the sideboard. And then the world went dark. The war years, for Bush, as for every set maker in Britain, were a long detour. Valves and parts went to the services. Consumer radios all but disappeared from the shop windows. Behind blackout curtains, the company turned its lathes and its soldering irons to whatever the government asked of it. Pieces of larger systems, sub-assemblies for the war effort, the kind of contribution that doesn't get its own museum case. The joint wartime enterprise, 44 manufacturers pooled by ministerial decree, produced the utility radio between 1944 and 1945, a single agreed wireless that sold over 175,000 sets. It was designed by a man called G.D. Reynolds of Murphy Radio, the firm that would one day be Bush's stablemate, but that's a knot in the story for later. When the lights came back on in 1945, the country that emerged into the daylight was poorer, hungrier, and changed. So was Bush. In that same year, the company merged with its sister firm, Cinema Television Limited. Both subsidiaries passed into the empire of J. Arthur Rank, Yorkshire flour magnate, devout Methodist, builder of the largest cinema chain in Britain, who had spent the war years quietly acquiring everything Garmont British had to sell. Bush was now part of the Rank organisation. The film company had become the parent of the wireless company twice over. Gilbert Darnley Smith stayed on, loudspeaker man turned set maker, founder of the firm, deputy chairman of what was now a national name. He'd been right about the future. He'd lived long enough to see his hedge become a household word, but the future he'd seen was about to outgrow Chiswick. Chapter 2. The Plan for Plymouth, Britain. In the late 1940s was not where you might have expected a major electronics expansion to land. Rationing was still on. The pound had been devalued, coal was scarce, and the cities that had been hammered by the Luftwaffe were still picking themselves up out of the rubble. Plymouth was one of those cities. The Blitz of March and April 1941 had destroyed the city centre. Over 1,000 civilians killed across the war, 20,000 buildings damaged, the heart of the place reduced to brick dust and timber. Devonport Dockyard had been the target. The streets around it had been the cost. By 1943, while the bombing was still going on, a town planner named Patrick Abercrombie and the city's chief engineer James Patton Watson had already started drawing up what they would call the Plan for Plymouth. It imagined 7 new estates rising on the city's fringes, neighbourhoods in the language of the plan, places designed to provide for life from cradle to grave, schools, clinics, pubs, churches, shops, green space, council housing on a scale Plymouth had never seen. One of those 7 estates was a piece of farmland on the northwest edge of the city, between the River Tamar and the village of St. Budeaux. The Saxons had called it Ernesettle, after a freeholder named William Ernesettle, whose name appears in records from 1428. Sir Francis Drake had owned land nearby. By 1945, it was earmarked for council houses, and, as part of Abercrombie's deliberate plan to diversify Plymouth away from its dependence on the Royal Navy, for the factories that would give the new residents somewhere to work. Rank's electronics division was looking for room to grow. Chiswick was full. Post-war consumer demand was about to burst the seams of every set maker in the country, and the government, eager to spread industry beyond London and the Midlands, was offering generous terms to firms willing to plant a flag in regions hungry for jobs. The deal made sense from both ends. Bush would get its factory. Plymouth would get its employer. In September 1948, a man named E.A. Carter, known to everyone as Ted, was sent down from Surrey to set the thing up. He brought with him a small team, including a Mr. Bennett and a Mr. Reg Jessup, and their families came with them. Plymouth had been comprehensively flattened. There was nowhere for them to live. The city allocated them council houses in Honnicknabble, one of the other new estates rising on the city's outskirts. From those addresses, they began the work of turning a building site by the Tamar into a functioning electronics factory. By 1949, the plant was operational. It sat on the bank of the river, about half a mile north of where Brunel's Great Royal Albert Bridge crossed into Cornwall. Aerial photographs from 1953 show the works as a long, low complex beside the Plymouth Corporation sewage farm. Not glamorous, exactly, but vast. From the day it opened, it began to draw labour out of the surrounding estates. 220 workers at first, then 400, then 1,000. The numbers would keep climbing through the 50s. Ted Carter ran it the way men of his generation ran factories. He was hands-on. He walked the floor. He knew his foremen by their first names and most of his assembly workers by sight. He took, as his son would later put it, great pleasure in the dedication and enthusiasm of his workforce. Outside the gates, he was a Rotarian and a St. John's ambulance man. He supported Plymouth Argyle, which is the kind of small biographical detail that tells you what kind of manager he was. Argyle in 1949 was a second division club. The local team, the one you supported if you actually lived there. This was the foundation. Council houses in Honnocknall, a factory by the Tamar, a manager who knew the names, workers walking from the estates to the works in the morning and home again in the evening, on roads that hadn't existed 5 years before. This was where Bush would make the radios that built its name. Chapter 3. The Bakelite Heart. There's a small brown object you may have seen in your grandmother's kitchen, or in a junk shop window, or behind the glass in an industrial design museum. It's a domed bakelite case about the size of a loaf of bread, with a cream lattice grill, a circular dial, and 3 round controls. It weighs more than you'd expect. It's a Bush DAC 90A, and in 1950, it was the most aspirational thing in the room. The original DAC 90 had appeared 4 years earlier. It was the work of an in-house designer named Frank Middleditch, a man whose name almost nobody remembers now, and it had been displayed at the Victoria and Albert Museum in the autumn of 1946 at an exhibition called Britain Can Make It, organised to show the country that British industry, having spent 6 years building bombers and tanks, could still make beautiful things for ordinary homes. 1.5 million people went to see it. The exhibition, in the trade's own joke, became Britain Can't Have It, because most of the goods on display were earmarked for export. But the Bush DAC 90 wasn't. The DAC 90 was for the front room. In February 1950, the company replaced it with the DAC 90A. Smaller valves inside, now available in walnut brown and cream ivory as well as black. The walnut model cost £12, 1 shilling and 8 pence. The cream cost a few shillings more, before purchase tax. For a working family in 1950, that was a serious outlay, the kind of purchase you saved for and you wiped down with a cloth on Sunday mornings. It stayed in production until the end of the decade. A collector today will tell you it is probably the most sought-after and collected vintage valve radio of our time. But Bush wasn't done. By the summer of 1950, the company was launching its first major bid for the post-war television market. The set was called the TV-22, and it cost £35 and 10 shillings, about 2 months' average pay for a working man. It had a 9-inch round screen behind a walnut bakelite case, because timber was still scarce, and bakelite was what you used when you wanted to put something handsome on the sideboard without queuing for wood. It received 405 lines, and, for the first time on a British set the owner could operate themselves, it could be retuned to any of the BBC's regional transmitters. From 1955, with the addition of a small band 3 converter, it could pick up the brand new ITV. Millions of British families watched the coronation, the Suez Crisis, and the first commercial breaks on a TV-22. The set on which they did so was built beside the Tamar, and then came the radio everyone remembers. In 1959, Bush launched the TR-82. The case had been drawn by a young industrial designer named David Ogle, who'd already used it on the Valve MB60 Portable 2 years earlier. Now it housed 7 transistors, a single diode, a ferrit rod aerial, and a single PP9 battery. It cost £17, 8 shillings and 11 pence, expensive for the day. And it came in cream or in a deep midnight blue, with a chrome grille across the front like the chevroned bonnet of an American car. It had a handbag-style handle. It was meant to be carried. The late 50s were the first moment in British history when teenagers had real disposable income, and the TR-82 was conceived from the start as a fashion accessory for young people, in contrast to the heavy cabinets that their parents had used. It became, almost immediately, synonymous with the word portable. It was on the kitchen counter, it was on the beach, it was on the building site and the factory floor. It was reissued in 1997, a Derby version followed in 2006 and again in 2014. The Science Museum holds one, the V&A holds one. A whole generation can hum, without prompting, the precise crackle that came out of its single elliptical speaker. What the buyers didn't know, what almost nobody in the trade quite saw yet, though some had a queasy feeling, was that the TR-82 had arrived 2 years late to a different race. In 1957, a small Japanese firm called Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo had launched a transistor radio called the TR-63. It measured 112mm by 71 by 32. You could put it in a shirt pocket. The firm renamed itself the following year. They called it Sony. Just as Bush perfected the chunky British portable, The Japanese had already shrunk the radio into something you could carry without anyone knowing you had it. Inside Ernesettle, none of this felt like a warning yet. The orders were still rising. The workforce was still expanding. By the early 60s, it would top out around 2,500, the size of a small town's working population, all of it walking through one set of gates. It was, like most British electronics work, a heavily female factory. Rows and rows of women at long benches, each one doing one small thing: soldering a joint, fitting a valve, winding a coil, threading a wire harness, and passing the chassis on. The men ran the cabinet shop and the test bench and the goods out. The women, in their hundreds, built the sets. June Warmingby joined in 1960. She worked in components, buying parts and liaising with the drawing office. Mr. Saunders had started in 1949, the year the factory opened, and would stay until 1967. There was a cricket team that did notably well in the Plymouth leagues, and even better against the East Cornwall sides across the river. There was a ladies' choir that sang at hospital fêtes. There was an annual works dance, the kind of event where the foreman's wife wore the dress she'd been saving, and the apprentices learned to ask politely. Ted Carter was there for all of it, hands-on as ever. The Rotary Club, the Ambulance Brigade, the Saturday afternoons at Home Park, watching Argyle lose to a side from Bristol. You walked through those gates with the warm smell of solder catching at the back of your throat, the heat of valves coming up to temperature, the canteen tea on the boil. You clocked in. You found your bench. You did your day's work to the rhythm of the radio playing from the supervisor's shelf. A bush, naturally. And at 3 o'clock, you broke for tea. And at 5, you walked back out. And on Friday afternoon, the wage packet was put into your hand, and you walked the half-mile home to a council house that hadn't existed when you were born. This was what a Plymouth working life looked like in 1960. This was what the company had built. This was the peak. Chapter 4. A View from the Summit. In 1962, two things happened that should have made Bush stronger and instead set the long fall in motion. The first was a merger. On the 4th of June, the Rank organisation completed the acquisition of Murphy Radio, that Welwyn Garden City firm founded 33 years earlier by Frank Murphy and E.J. Power. Murphy had a reputation for engineering quality and a loyal following. It had also designed the utility radio of the wartime years. Now Rank brought Bush and Murphy together under a single roof. The new entity was called Rank Bush Murphy. Two famous names, two separate sales forces, both reporting up into one combined management. On paper, it was a logical consolidation. In practice, it was the moment Bush stopped being a company and started being a division. The second thing happened in October. Sir John Davis succeeded J. Arthur Rank as chairman of the Rank organisation. Davis was an accountant. He'd come up through the books rather than the studios. He was disciplined, hard-working, and possessed of a certainty about his own judgment that those around him noticed early. He'd already made his most important decision 6 years before this, back in 1956, when he'd arranged for Rank to take a stake in a small American photocopier firm called the Haloid Company. Haloid would shortly rename itself Xerox. The deal Davis had brokered would, over the next 2 decades, pour money into Rank's coffers on a scale that nobody at the company had ever seen before. It would change everything, and not for the better, because the more Xerox earned, the less Rank needed to care about anything else. Cinemas could decline. Television manufacturing could underperform. Hotels and bingo halls and motorway service stations could be acquired, neglected, sold on. The Xerox check kept arriving. The discipline that builds a manufacturing business, the relentless reinvestment, the obsessive attention to quality, the willingness to fight for every percentage point of market share, became unnecessary at Rank. Why bother? The money came in anyway. This is how strategic neglect begins, not with a malicious decision, with the slow draining of urgency from the people who are supposed to feel it. For now, in 1962, none of this was visible from the floor at Ernesettle. The factory was running flat out. The TR-82 was selling everywhere. Colour television was on the horizon, and Bush would be there for it. There were 3,000 people on the books across the company, more than 2,000 of them in Plymouth. But 300 miles east of Devon, in a country still rebuilding from its own war, the Japanese were building factories of their own. Sony was already a name in America. Matsushita, Hitachi, and Toshiba were watching the British market and learning its weaknesses. The transistor was giving way to the integrated circuit. The chunky portable was giving way to the pocket radio. And the British set makers, fat on the easy market of the 50s, were about to discover that the world they thought they understood had quietly stopped existing while they were looking the other way. Standing at the peak in 1962, you couldn't see the cliff. The orders were strong. The factory was full. Ted Carter, 10 years from his death, was still walking the floor. The cricket team had a good season ahead. These walls would one day fall silent. The car park that filled every morning with Morris Minors and bicycles would one day stand empty. But not yet. Not yet. Chapter 5. The Japanese at the Gate. For most of the 1960s, Bush kept selling. Color television was coming. The orders held. Anybody walking through Ernesettle in 1968 would have seen a factory at full stretch. 2,500 people on shifts. The lorries queuing at the goods out for their loads of cabinets in walnut veneer. But underneath the floor, the ground was shifting. The first sign came on the shop window of the high street television rental shop. In the early 70s, Sony and Hitachi launched UK colour televisions that cost less than £200. The British sets, made the British way, were dearer. They were also less reliable. The trade veterans who serviced them would tell you years later, with no satisfaction, that Rank's early T20 colour chassis was pretty unreliable, with many faulty straight from the box. The Japanese sets were solid state. The British sets still leaned on valves and discrete transistors. The Japanese had moved to integrated circuits. They had moved to automated assembly. They had moved to a kind of quality control that didn't exist on the floor at Ernesettle, where 6 trade unions, by some accounts 7, had to be navigated before any change to a process could be agreed. The European community tried to slow the invasion. Toshiba was initially restricted to importing just 20,000 sets a year into Britain. The Japanese answer was simple and patient. If they couldn't ship sets in, they would build sets here. They would come for the factories themselves. But this is only the external half of the story. The other half is what was happening inside Rank. The Xerox money kept arriving. Year after year, the check grew larger. The leisure division was bought. The bingo halls, the motorway service stations, the hotels in faraway places, and the consumer electronics division, the bit that included Bush and Murphy and the factory at Ernesettle, was treated as the part of the empire it was hardest to be bothered with. It had a top-heavy management structure. It had lost control of costs. It had overdone its expansion. It had failed to make a name for itself in export markets. By 1978, its accumulated losses came to £22 million. £22 million against a parent company swimming in Xerox profit. The maths of indifference is brutal. The division was bleeding, but the bleeding didn't matter, because the patient was rich. So nothing got fixed. Research and development withered. The 7 separate trade unions kept vying to get their voices heard, and the management, overburdened, fragmented, fundamentally uninterested, couldn't raise output to a viable level. The historian Geoffrey McNabb put the verdict plainly. For Rank's decline, he wrote, John Davis must take the blame. Davis had brokered the deal that made the company rich. The same deal made it lazy. By the mid-70s, the rest of British set-making was already in retreat. In 1976, Thorn closed its colour tube factory at Skelmersdale, and 1,300 jobs went with it. The same year, Pye, Bush's old rival, was absorbed by Philips, and its Lowestoft plant was sold on to Sanyo. The British television industry was being dismantled, factory by factory, while the workforce on each floor watched the floor next door fall and wondered when their turn would come. At Ernesettle, the lights stayed on. 2,500 jobs. Ted Carter was gone. He'd died in 1972, aged 65, still walking the floor he'd opened 23 years before. The cricket team played on. The ladies' choir still sang. But the orders were softer than they had been. And in London, in the boardrooms of the Rank organisation, the men who held the strings of Bush's future were beginning to discuss what they might do with a business they no longer wanted to run themselves. The decision they reached was extraordinary. They would invite the Japanese inside. Chapter 6. The Partnership That Wasn't. In 1978, 2 things happened in quick succession. First, Rank dismembered its electronics holdings. The Rank Bush-Murphy name, along with the scientific instruments side of the business, was sold to the conglomerate Great Universal Stores. What stayed with Rank was the part that actually made televisions, under a new banner called Rank Radio International. The division had been losing money for years. The sale to Gus suggested a company tidying up its accounts, separating the bits it could offload from the bits it might still try to fix. Then, almost in the same breath, came the second decision. Rank announced a joint venture with Toshiba. The Japanese firm needed a way past the import quota. Rank needed engineering it couldn't afford to develop. The deal, on paper, gave each side what it lacked. Toshiba would supply the designs and the manufacturing know-how. Rank would supply the factory, the workforce, and the controlling stake. The factory in question was Ernesettle. For the men and women on the assembly line, the news arrived as something between hope and unease. Hope, because Toshiba's reputation for quality was already established. The Japanese knew how to build a set that worked. Unease, because the Japanese also had a reputation for a kind of demanding precision that had no parallel on a British factory floor. The new venture was given a target: 350,000 sets a year. It was a serious number. To meet it, Bush would need every line running, every shift staffed, every component flowing in on time. It did not meet it. The trade journalists watching the venture were generous in their language and damning in their content. Rank, as the majority shareholder, held on to the reins of management. The expected changes did not materialize. The company failed to achieve the necessary economies of scale. Toshiba's engineering and organizational skills were apparently underexploited. Production peaked at around 270,000 sets, 80,000 short of target, year after year. Inside the factory, the British side was running it the way it had always been run. The Japanese side wanted things done differently. Both sides knew the arrangement wasn't working. The numbers were the proof. By the autumn of 1980, the Toshiba executives had concluded that the marriage could not be saved on the terms they had been given. In December, the joint venture was ended. Toshiba withdrew. Rank was left holding a factory it had not been able to make profitable, even with Japanese engineering at its shoulder. Now it would have to decide what to do with a television manufacturing operation it had spent 2 decades neglecting, 18 months pretending to fix, and not a single year, by 1981, of actually wanting. The decision came on a January morning. Rank Radio International announced it was closing its Plymouth factory. 2 months later, it confirmed that the entire television manufacturing business was being wound up. 3,000 people across 4 factories in Devon and Cornwall were made redundant. The exact split between sites was never widely published, but the bulk of those jobs were at Ernesettle. 2 months of disbelief followed. The men and women who had built Bush radios and televisions for 32 years were told to clear their lockers. Sir John Davis, the man who had architected the Xerox deal, the man whose accountancy mind had built the company that could afford to neglect a division, was by this point the non-executive president of the Rank organization. The day-to-day running was no longer his. The decision to wind up television was taken below him, but the long indifference that made the decision possible was his work, and nobody else's. By 1981, he was approaching the end of an era it had taken him a quarter of a century to build. The era was ending in Plymouth, in a January announcement, in the silent corridors of a factory by the Tamar. In May 1981, Rank sold the Murphy name to a firm called J.J. Silber. In July, it sold the Bush name to 2 young entrepreneurs, Mark Flutter and Richard Schlagman, for £600,000. The price was less than the cost of a small house in Hampstead. The names had been worth something once. By the summer of 1981, they were worth what someone, anyone, would pay to put them on something else. One more detail of the timing is worth pausing over. On the 25th of January 1981, in the same month, Rank closed the Plymouth factory, the Member of Parliament for Plymouth Devonport, the constituency that contained Ernesettle, gave a press conference in London. His name was David Owen. The press conference was the Limehouse Declaration, the founding moment of the Social Democratic Party. While his constituency was losing its biggest manufacturer, its MP was helping to break the Labour Party in 2. History sometimes doesn't arrange its coincidences gently. Chapter 7. The Bank Holiday Shift. The factory did not stay closed for long. Within 2 months of Rank's announcement, Toshiba was back, not as a partner this time, as an owner. The company that had walked out in December returned in the spring with a new proposition. It would take over the Plymouth factory itself. It would build Toshiba sets on Toshiba terms. For the workers who had just been made redundant, this should have been salvation. The factory was reopening. The lights would come back on. The hooter would sound again. But Toshiba was not rehiring everyone. It was hiring 300, not 3,000. 300. 900 people applied. The applications went through screening. The successful candidates were brought in for an induction. They were sat down in front of a television and shown a videotape prepared by the new managing director, a man called Jeffrey Death, who would later go on to run Ainsley China, emphasizing the values of the new owner: punctuality, attendance, quality, flexibility. The watching workers understood what was being said. The terms had changed. The old factory was gone. The new factory would be Japanese. Of the 300 taken on, all but one had worked at the old company. They were going back into the same building they had walked out of weeks before. The same benches, the same lines, the same rivets in the same girders overhead. But the canteen had changed. Rank had operated 4 canteens, one for managers, one for the engineers, one for the foreman, one for the floor. Toshiba had one. Everybody ate together. Everybody, from the managing director to the postboy, wore the same blue jacket. Everybody was on first-name terms. Everybody was paid monthly. There were no piece rates. There was one trade union, the EETPU, with sole bargaining rights. The 6 unions of the rank era had been compressed into one as a condition of the new owner walking back through the gate. The reopening was on a bank holiday. There was no mention of extra pay. Ron Pemberton was one of the lucky ones. He'd joined Rank Toshiba in 1978 as a security man. He'd been made redundant with everyone else. Now he was back, in charge of the soldering irons. He described the new regime in the language of a man trying to be fair. They want their pound of flesh, he said. They expect a day's work for a day's pay. Then, later, more honestly, the shock of being out of work was very great. If they turned to you and asked if you would accept flexibility or whatever, there were 10 people in the queue behind you who would. So, you said yes. They could practically put in any conditions they wanted. 900 applicants, 300 jobs, 10 people in the queue behind you. The new management team was small. Death ran it on the British side, with 5 senior British managers under him. The Japanese side was headed by an engineering manager named Mr. K. Komada. The initial target was modest, 100,000 sets a year out of 300 people. Compared to the Rank Toshiba target of 350,000, it was a tenth of the ambition. But it was a target they could actually hit. They hit it, and then they exceeded it. Turnover quadrupled between 1981 and 1987. By 1990, the factory was making 600,000 colour televisions a year. Not a single day was lost to industrial action across the decade. The Plymouth experiment, Japanese management transplanted to a British factory, became the celebrated case study of the era. Origami swans were awarded for quality. Single-status working was held up as a model. The trade press called it a miracle. In one sense, that was true. The work survived. The wages were paid. The mortgages on the council houses in Ernesettle and Honnicknall were kept up. A new microwave oven division was added. An air conditioning factory followed. 2,500 jobs did not come back. But the building did not stand empty. Children of the original bush workers got jobs at Toshiba. The streets that the factory had filled still filled every morning with people heading through the gates. The work survived under foreign ownership. The British company didn't, and the workforce that walked back in through those gates in 1981 had been broken first. 3,000 people made redundant. 300 rehired on the new owner's terms. The same building, the same job, different conditions, different management, different pay structure, different language for what you were doing and who you were doing it for. The negotiation had been one-sided from the start. There were 10 people in the queue behind you. That is what happened at Ernesettle in the spring of 1981. The work did not die. The company that had built it did, and the people who built the work were made to apply in their own factory for the privilege of going back to it. Chapter 8. The Polish Decision. For 28 years, the Toshiba factory ran. The case studies were written. The management consultants brought their cohorts down from London to study the floor. Plymouth, once a byword for everything British manufacturing had got wrong, became a byword for what could go right. The work was good. The product was good. The relationship with the EETPU, later Amicus, later Unite, was good. The Japanese had taken what rank had nearly killed and made it work. And then, on the 24th of April 2009, the meeting was called. The staff at the Ernesettle factory were gathered together. The announcement was made by Andy Bass, the managing director of Toshiba Information Systems in the UK. Toshiba was moving its television production to Kobiesice in Poland. 270 of the 321 jobs at Ernesettle would go. 50 would remain, for engineering and refurbishment. The accounts of that meeting do not need embellishing. People were breaking down crying left, right and centre, one worker told the Plymouth Herald. One woman reportedly collapsed in the car park. This came right out of nowhere. Terry Keefe, the Unite officer for Plymouth, called it a bolt out of the blue. "We're just completely stunned by it," he said. The staff are devastated. Andy Bass, speaking to the trade press, said the company had 28 years of history with Plymouth and was indebted to the people who had worked with it over those years and to the wider community. He meant it. By the standards of how factory closures get announced in modern Britain, it was a decent statement. But the closure went ahead anyway. The work was going to Poland. The cost base was lower there. The European Union had made it easy. There was one final irony, noticed by the workers themselves. The factory had, in its last years, employed a number of Polish migrant workers. The work was moving to where they had come from. The streets of Ernesettle would not now be needed for assembly. Kobiesice would be. 60 years of electronics manufacturing on the site by the Tamar came to an end. The doors closed. The car park emptied for the last time. The aerial photographs from the early 50s, showing a long, low complex beside the sewage farm, the river bending past it on its way to the sea. They were now historical documents. The Toshiba afterlife had been a remarkable second chapter. But chapters end. Chapter 9. The name on the box. Walk into an Argos today. Pick up the catalogue or scroll the website on your phone. Among the cheapest of everything, the cheapest tablet, the cheapest television, the cheapest washing machine, the cheapest kettle, you will find a name you may not have thought about for 30 years. Bush. The name has been on a long journey since 1981. Mark Flutter and Richard Schlagman, who bought it from Rank for £600,000, used it on imported radio alarms and cassette recorders, and floated their company as Bush Radio plc in 1984. In 1986, they sold to Prestwich Holdings for $15 million. In 1988, Prestwich sold to Alba plc for $6 million. Under Alba, the name went on to more and more imported goods, mostly from China, later from Turkey. In November 2008, the Home Retail Group, the parent of Argos and Homebase, bought the Alba and Bush names together for £15.25 million. The trademarks, said their spokesperson, were household names with very strong heritage. In 2016, Sainsbury's bought Home Retail Group, and Bush became, in the end, a supermarket's budget label. In 2022, the Alba name was quietly retired. Bush was promoted to be the single budget brand of the supermarket's electronics shelf. Today, you can buy a Bush television, made in Turkey by a firm called Vestel, for less than the cost of a meal out. You can buy a Bush tumble dryer, a Bush dishwasher, a Bush smartphone, one of the Spira range, briefly attempted in 2015, quickly forgotten. A Bush tablet, the My Tablet, launched in 2013 and noted, in the trade press, to be a flop. You can buy a Bush portable DVD player that was recalled in 2016 for a faulty power adapter. You can buy a Bush tumble dryer that, in 2019, was the subject of an Argos safety alert warning of fire risk. You can also buy a Bush classic radio, a reproduction of the TR-82, made in China. A collector who tried one described it as not featuring the same quality of speaker or internal frame, with the sound suffering from lower power and a muddy sound, the design without the substance, the name without the maker. In Plymouth, the council estate at Ernesettle is still there, the streets that Patrick Abercrombie planned, the houses that Ted Carter and his founding team moved into in 1948 when there was nowhere else to put them. The cricket team is gone. The ladies' choir is gone. The full male employment that the doctoral historians have documented as central to the post-war estate is gone too. The factory site has been redeveloped. The river still bends past where the goods out used to be. The Royal Albert Bridge still carries the railway over into Cornwall. You can stand on the bank of the Tamar on a winter morning, and you can hear the wind and the gulls and the traffic on the road across the water, and nothing else. The TR-82 is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. The Deke 90A is in private collections. The TV-22 is in the Science Museum store. In the offices of the Sainsbury's buying team in Holborn, a procurement manager is, this week, signing a purchase order with a Turkish supplier for the next shipment of Bush-branded televisions to come off a production line 2,000 miles from Plymouth. The maker is gone. The name is owned. The name is monetized, not through one catastrophe, through 50 years of small decisions, each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it, until the work was abroad, and the workers were retired, and the only thing left of Bush was a sticker on a box, and a brown bakelite radio behind glass in a London museum, and the silence of a stretch of river in Plymouth where the morning hooter used to sound.